Hello, I'm Richard McGrath, the curate from St Mary-at-Finchley. I'm currently here on day one of self-isolation, feeling absolutely fine, but just playing it safe. This is a first in hopefully a series of short video reflections that we'll be doing. The title of this reflection is Christianity Through Books. I remember as a child having the Guinness Book of Records and reading that the Bible is apparently the world's #1 most stolen book. Hopefully lots of people are reading it as well. Now there are lots of famous Christian books, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. For evangelicals, there's John Stott's The Cross of Christ. There are spiritual classics, The Way of the Pilgrim and so on. And I became a Christian through reading a book. Obviously one becomes a Christian really through God pouring the Holy Spirit to your heart, but in a sense I became a Christian through reading a book, through reading this particular book, the Confessions of St Augustine of Hippo, for an essay at university, and I'll come back to the Confessions later. But I remember thinking, who becomes a Christian through reading books? It just seemed kind of strange to me. It seemed like I hadn't done things the right way. How do people become Christians? I don't know what image we have in mind, whether it's a sort of medieval peasant having a vision of the Virgin Mary, or a great evangelical conversion experience, being convicted of sin in your heart, or even just all the people who are brought up by Christian families who at some point decide they want to take the faith on for themselves. But who becomes a Christian through reading a book? It was only much later I had the story of St Ignatius of Loyola. Now, I will probably mangle this story entirely, but St Ignatius was a soldier. He was wounded in battle, and while he was laid up in bed, while he was recovering, he had a pile of books. All he could really do was sit and read. And he had a pile of books of sort of stories of knights rescuing damsels in distress and fighting dragons and so on. And he also had a pile of books of lives of the saints. And he found that although he enjoyed the books about knights rescuing damsels in distress, fighting dragons, he would enjoy them at the time, but afterwards they would leave him feeling empty. Whereas when he read about the lives of the saints, afterwards he'd leave, even for a long time afterwards, he'd feel good, he'd feel consoled and restored somehow. And that was really the first thing that sent St Ignatius, the great evangelist, on his road towards Christianity, was through reading books while he was convalescing. It's an important story nowadays when, of course, lots of people will be self-isolating or stuck at home and will, hopefully, God willing, have time to sit and read books. And maybe we'll, in future videos, have some recommendations there. Just going back to Augustine, I later reread Augustine when I was studying for theology, studying for ministry, and what really struck me was the chapter 8, the famous chapter where Augustine, you might say, comes to faith in a Milanese garden. There's a picture on the cover here. Augustine weeping beneath a tree in a Milanese garden. But what brings him to that point? Well, obviously the whole of his life story so far, but earlier in that chapter he has some visitors. The first tells him a story about a famous intellectual of Augustine's day, Victorinus, who converted to Christianity. An intellectual man, just like Augustine at the time probably thought himself. And then another friend comes and tells a longer story. It tells about two of this man's friends who worked for government, were government agents, and once had been in the imperial gardens. They'd stumbled across a meeting of Christians who were studying the life of St Anthony, the great Egyptian monk. And they were astonished and they were intrigued by this new life, and they decide there and then they want to know more, they want to become Christians, they want to take up this kind of proto-monastic life. So Anthony of Egypt in the desert, St Athanasius writes a biography of St Anthony. These Christians read it in this garden in Milan. They bump into some government agents who tell their friend, who tells St Augustine, who finds this is really the straw that breaks the camel's back, that makes him, really pushes him, by God's grace, over into becoming a Christian. And what can we learn from this? Two things. The first is the importance of telling stories. So we have Augustine who's writing his own story, which in turn incorporates all these other stories he's heard. The importance of telling stories about how he came to faith. And I realise perhaps that's always a hard thing to do. Perhaps now it's particularly hard when people just aren't going out and about as much. But I've also recently been reading the Grace Abounding by John Bunyan. And there's a lovely line at the beginning I'll just finish with, where Bunyan, who is writing to his flock from prison, he writes to them and he remarks, "It is profitable for Christians to be often calling to mind the very beginnings of grace with their souls." It is profitable for Christians to be often calling to mind the very beginnings of grace with their souls. And so that's a principle that leads Bunyan to write the story of his own life, his own conversion, for the benefit of his flock. But I just think how great it is for all of us to maybe stop and just think about the beginnings of the work of grace in our own souls. About those moments where God's grace has shone in our lives, perhaps at the start of our Christian journey, perhaps at some memorable parts. Should we stop and remember those? And to give thanks for them. And if we're feeling low, perhaps particularly at this time, to use as a way of meditating on God's grace to us in the past, and the hope and the firm assurance that God will be graceful to us again in future.